Good afternoon to all of you. I think we must all be pretty relieved. It's November, only one more month to go. Only that many more SG50 conferences and celebrations and other things to go. The only thing I'm really happy for SG50, besides all these numerous conferences that you're obliged to attend or to speak at, is that I became a grandfather this year, so my son got the SG50 package, and it's quite lucrative. I don't need to tell you about it, but it's not the only reason I would vote for PAP, but the SG50 package was pretty good. Now, as a sort of closing keynote, what you're supposed to do is essentially try to summarize what other people have done and so on. Based on what I just heard, I mean, I can actually say the economic future of Singapore, the dream of Singapore, is to be able to sit in an OSIM chair in Singapore Airlines, eating sushi, and it's all videotaped and put into a Trek 2000 thumb drive. That is the vision of the future. Now, unfortunately, I think it's a bit more than that. The job of a closing keynote is essentially to not really be responsible for whatever you have to say, because you can blame it that as the person trying to close up things, you're just summarizing everybody else. And this reminds me of an anecdote just 2 days ago. 2 days ago, I launched a book, and that book was nothing but a compilation of lectures that I gave as the IPS S.R. Nathan Fellow, where last year I had to give a whole series of lectures, and they compiled it into a book. So I did a book launch, and it was at Kinokuniya, and some people lined up. And then some guy came up to me and said, "Can you sign this book?" I said, "Sure, I'm so pleased you want to buy my book." Then he looked at me and said, "Is there any sex in it?" So I was pretty quick on the take. I said, "I'm not responsible. I go and ask the guy who wrote the lectures. There might be a lot of sex in it. I don't know." So he said, okay. He bought the book. So my point here is that if there's anything here you don't like, I'm not responsible for it. I just summarize what everybody else has said. And if there's anything you like, then you buy the book. So essentially what I wanted to do today, having read, I wasn't here for minister's opening speech, but I think what I'd like to do today is take us all a little bit more beyond the granular perspectives about our own businesses and so on, but to take on what the three panels essentially focused on, which was, I think the first panel actually focused on what has made us successful. The second panel discussed family businesses and so on, and talked about how do we actually sustain our success. And the third panel, I think, was supposed to touch on how to maintain our global competitiveness, which actually means where do we go from here. My key response to these questions is we need to ask ourselves, what if we fail? And more importantly, the corollary to that is, if we're going to know how and when we fail, we must at the same time know how and when we have succeeded. And that means we need to define for ourselves, what is the end game? What is the final goal for Singapore as a society, and not only for our businesses? And of course, I'm not talking about the next 5 years or 10 years, but if we're talking about SG50, we should talk about the next 50 years. How do we know we've succeeded as a country? And if we don't have some definitions and measures for ourselves, we will just chug along, all very focused on our own businesses. Mine might succeed, yours might fail. How do we know as a country we have succeeded, except by measuring our GDP growth, which we all know by now is really a pretty crude and inaccurate gauge of actual national success, development, and happiness. If I can take you back a little bit, you've been hearing the new mantra from all our ministers today, this morning, and other times. And that's the whole issue about we have to create value and not just add value. What is the context? What's the historical context for this, and why is everybody talking about it now? And I think in order to understand the difference between adding value and creating value, we also have to understand what is the difference between relative advantage and proprietary advantage. Now, I think the two concepts are very, very closely related. Whether you run a business or you run a country, we all know starting from Adam Smith's days, talking about comparative advantage and absolute advantage, it's the same sort of thing. There are advantages that you have as a country or as a company, which is relative to another country or to a company. And there are advantages which are proprietary to you, that belong to you, like having a brand or having a technology. I think my point is that for the last 50 years, for Singapore as a whole, we have succeeded totally on the basis of relative advantage, never on proprietary advantage. If you look at one of the key drivers of our relative advantage, and there are two, location and cost. Location was clearly one of our key advantages. I don't need to go into it. We are a maritime hub, we are entrepot port, we are an aviation hub, and so on. We are located as a center of Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. That is a relative advantage because it's relative to where other countries are. That relative advantage in many ways has gone. If you look at how Dubai Airport is perhaps maybe even bigger than Singapore, and Emirates is able to compete with Singapore Airlines. So aspects of that locational advantage, we're quickly losing. Our port status, we're losing perhaps to Shanghai, and so on. The other aspect of our relative advantage was lower labor cost. We were the more nimble country with low labor costs compared to OECD countries. We were a bit more expensive than Malaysia or Thailand, but we were certainly much cheaper than OECD countries, and therefore we succeeded on the basis of contract manufacturing. I think so many companies here, including mine, the one that I took over from my father, not Ban Sri, they were all involved in contract manufacturing. Whether you were assembling disk drives or anything else, it was really on the basis that you were cheaper than the OECD countries, and so you made things for them. So it was always lower labor costs, and it was always relative advantage on the basis of geography. Now, if you take us today, the locational advantage we have today is a lot less. The cost advantage we have is virtually nothing. We are, in fact, on a per capita GDP basis, we are probably more expensive than most other OECD countries. And that's where I think the whole context of creating value comes in. Adding value to your relative advantage was always incremental. Creating value from something that was never there previously, that is actually creating value. And how do you create value then? I think there are three basic ways. One is you take the relative advantage that you had before, which was our hub status, and you build upon it so that what used to be a relative advantage is actually now absolute and proprietary and not based on location. If you look at the industries that we had that were based on relative advantages, if you take aviation, if you take petrochemicals, if you take life sciences, or even banking, it was all based on Singapore's location. But if you look at aviation today, we may have a situation, and I know Suha doesn't particularly want to hear this, but we may have a situation where Singapore Airlines is going to be upped by another airline. Changi Airport may not be able to compete with another, but because over the years we have deepened and broadened the entire aviation industry as a strategic cluster, because we now have aircraft leasing available in Singapore, because we now are one of the leading manufacturers of avionics in Singapore, because we now do global repairs for sophisticated turbine engines in Singapore, I think we can truly say that Singapore as an integrated aviation cluster now stands alone in the world, regardless of the fact that maybe Singapore as a whole, as a hub, is declining. And the same thing goes for rig building. We used to build rigs because they were always being used in Indonesia. Now we build rigs that are shipped all over the world. We used to do pharmaceutical sciences largely because of the fact that it was cheaper here. Now we've added R&D, we've used our universities and so on to essentially create a proprietary advantage. So that's one area we need to continue to focus on at the macro level. Another thing we need to focus on, which I think is very important for all companies, is to take what you would have thought is your weakness and to transform it to a strength. What are some of the weaknesses of Singapore? One is demographic, and the other one is our dependence on water. And you know how today we have moved very rapidly to be one of the global centers for water management and water technology. So that has taken something that was a negative in Singapore, one of our weaknesses, into a global strength. As a small city state, which is able to integrate social engineering with actual physical engineering, We've become one of the pioneers of urban solutions. So that's another area where we are leading the world. As another country where we have emphasized on keeping a manufacturing sector, but we are so small that we cannot even afford to have the slightest pollution, we are now one of the leaders in the world for clean technology. So essentially, what we had to do in Singapore for our own survival, we've turned around now and made it into a proprietary advantage. And finally, of course, something that is, I think, relevant to most of the people here with SBF is the whole issue of entrepreneurship. The value of entrepreneurship in the economic sense in Singapore is not just because it's a nice thing to talk about. Most people I know who talk about entrepreneurship, except people in this room who are really serious businessmen, most people you talk to about entrepreneurship, they mean investment bankers and lawyers who go and set up a cafe in Singapore. That is the entrepreneurship that you always read about in the life section of the Straits Times. And that's a real entrepreneur, setting up a new bar, setting up a new pub. But I think all of you know that true entrepreneurship means a lot more than that. It can mean, in my view, two basic levels. One level is you actually create a brand, such as OSIM has done, such as Charles & Keith has done, such as Bread Talk has done. You create a brand that you own, and that's proprietary to you. People can sue you if they steal you can sue them if they steal your IP, as we've discussed, but nevertheless, it's still your brand, and you can take it overseas. It belongs to you. And that's one of the key values of entrepreneurship, because it's rooted here. The founders are here, and therefore it's likely to be built up upon Singapore's base. The second aspect of entrepreneurship, which is a lot less sexy and so on, but clearly is just as important to Singapore, and we've had it throughout Singapore's economic history, are in fact engineers, dull, boring engineers who've worked in multinational companies like Hewlett-Packard for 10, 15 years until they're in their early 40s. And then together with some friends, they leave the multinational, they set up another company to supply to the multinational, and by doing so, they've de-risked the risk inherent with entrepreneurship. In that way, they're also entrepreneurs, and they're also proprietary to Singapore. So basically, I think through three very macro, broad ways, Singapore can move as a country and an economy away from relying on relative advantage, which means adding value, to creating value through deepening and broadening our existing economic clusters, leveraging on our uniqueness and our strengths, and really truly building upon entrepreneurship in the true sense of the word. Now, there's also risk, of course, involved in such an enterprise, and we're all seeing it now. I think we're all suffering because of the economic restructuring. One risk is the high cost that we have in Singapore. We are at OECD levels of costs, and yet we are surrounded by countries at much lower costs, and that's a real predicament. We also are facing a productivity trap. I mean, unlike what the Legatum Institute said recently, that Singapore is the most competitive economy in the world because they just measured total productivity by capital and labor and not the value add of it. We are now judged as being the most productive country in the world. But we also know, all of us who are business people here know, that in many, many sectors, Singapore's productivity lags way behind other countries. And unless we can make that painful restructuring, this could really be a hindrance to our economic growth. And finally is the whole conundrum and the contradiction over foreign labor. On one hand, one aspect of foreign labor is foreign talent. On the other hand, it is low-cost, cheap labor. This is an issue that I think probably stresses out almost every one of us here, this whole issue of the foreign element in Singapore's population. What do we do about this in the longer term? Not just what do you do about it in your own business, the difficulty you have about getting work permits, the difficulty you have about attracting people to your business, but over the longer term, Singapore as a nation and as a society, we depend so much on foreign workers, the high-end foreign workers, meaning the bankers, the lawyers, the architects, and the low-end foreign workers. But it's a huge social and economic problem that we really truly haven't come to grips with. I addressed part of this issue at a recent talk at the Singapore Economic Society, which was covered in the Straits Times, and essentially what they basically covered in the Straits Times was that my point that the danger to Singapore out of the problems we're facing is not this overdramatic one about we're going to descend into the sea's going to cover us up, and Singapore will be gone from the face of the earth. I mean, that's quite dramatic. I know that we're supposed to say that we cannot take our existence for granted, we can never take our existence for granted, etc. But we all know that the actual likelihood that we can sink into the sea isn't very high. So what then is a realistic danger for Singapore? And my point was that the realistic danger for Singapore is we could gradually grow so slow, we could age so much as a society, we could leave problems that are facing us in the longer term unattended, so that essentially, as a city and as a really, truly a little red dot that's not important to the rest of the world, we become an irrelevant entity in the world economy. We will continue to exist as Japan has continued to exist through 20 years of stagnation. We will continue to exist because as our population declines, we don't need a very high growth rate. We could essentially still have negative growth, but with declining population, you could still have slightly positive or stagnant per capita GDP. But the danger to us as a small society is that we will become a second-tier city in the whole global context. And I think that is a danger that if we're not really aware of, we will slowly sink into it like the proverbial frog that you put into a cooking pot. I mean, it's a proverb, I've never really tried it. You're supposed to put a frog in a pot and you turn up the heat and the frog doesn't even know it and it dies very happily. I'm not sure whether my children would ever want to try that, but I hope it is a true saying. We become, I think, irrelevant in various ways. We can become irrelevant through economic stagnation, like we are already, unfortunately, beginning to see in the capital markets. Our stock exchange is becoming smaller and smaller in the regional and the global context. We could see it but we could see this decline disguised through demographics, as I mentioned. It can be a very genteel decline and we sitting in our little well, like 坐井观天, you don't really know that we are declining as a country. One of the major reasons that I think we can decline is what I would call social schizophrenia. The tensions between the demands of a global city, which in many ways we are, and you just need to go to Marina Bay and see what a global city consists of, and the tensions of remaining a parochial kampong, which we still are. The tensions between this globalism and this parochialism is something that I think we see ourselves every day, and we see manifested since 2011 and the elections then. This tension between the Singapore core, so to speak, and foreign talent, this us versus them, and the identity crisis that this creates, we can become, if we're not careful, a schizoid city, torn between, on one hand, the globalism of Raffles Place and the parochialism of our new towns. And there's neither one is right or the other is wrong. It's just the fact that the two of them collide and do not mesh well. And on top of that, of course, are the contradictions between the so-called Singapore core and the hundreds of thousands of foreign workers who today still live somewhat secluded and apart from us, like in Dubai, but in certain moments, like we saw in the riots, that comes to a head when it clashes with the other part of Singapore. I think we've all talked much about how Singapore is an improbable nation and how we've managed to survive despite all that. But we are at the same time also an undefinably diverse society. If you really look around the world, I don't think there are any other cities that are so diverse ethnically, culturally, linguistically, within its own local population, and at the same time has such a great disparity between locals and foreigners. Now let's do a sort of quick global landscape. I think if you talk about diversity, there are essentially three types of cities in this world. They're the homogeneous cities, there's the diverse but cohesive cities, and there's the diverse and divided cities. Now, Singapore cannot be the first. We cannot really be a homogeneous society, and I'll tell you why. We want to be the second. We want to be diverse, but cohesive. But the real danger is that we can end up being the third, which is diverse and divided. Now let's take the homogeneous global cities. These are pretty easy to trot out. You think of them: Tokyo, Shanghai, Frankfurt. One is almost 100% Japanese, 100% Chinese, 100% German. It's totally homogeneous. The foreigners in their midst, the different languages spoken there are so few that they're very, very homogeneous. They're linked to the world culture. Shanghai, Tokyo, Frankfurt are really linked to the world economy, but they are very homogeneous. That is not Singapore. And if we think we can be like them, we would be truly mistaken. The second type is the cohesive and yet diverse global city. And one good example would be New York City. There's a cacophony of languages the minute you go into New York. It's a United Nations of different cultures. It is not simply subscribing to our CMIO, 4 silos of CMIO. There are multitudes of different ethnic and cultural identities in New York. But the difference is they are all cohesive. Every person you speak to in New York would define themselves first as an Albanian Jew or Bangladeshi or Rajasthani, but you ask them and they'll say, I'm also a New Yorker. There's an overriding sense of this cohesiveness. Now the third type is a diverse and divided global city, which I think the best example is Dubai. In Dubai, for anybody who's familiar with it, there is such rigid social stratification that it's almost like living in different ghettos. At the top of the pile would be not only white people, but they have to be pretty much Anglo-Saxon white people. And then the middle line would be your Chinese and Malaysians, the Singaporeans and Malaysians who only can be CFOs because we can be trusted with numbers. Then as you get a little bit browner down the line, you're usually in the service sector, you're Filipino and you're Thai. And as you get even darker, you're really at the total bottom of the wood pile and you basically engage in construction work. And you live totally segregated from everybody else. The only time you ever meet would be in what people call the mixing is in the malls. And that's about it. And the locals are totally entitled. There's an incredible sense of entitlement that everybody owes them a living. And the kind of culture that exists in Dubai, to me, is not utopia, it's dystopia. It is a society where I think if we ever became like Dubai, I would truly worry for Singapore. No integration at all, everybody living on their own lives, and really very rigid social stratification. So, where are we? And what do we want to be as a city, as a nation, and as a society? Because unless we define that, economic growth in its own right has no value. And given our unique situation, given that we have a very diverse national population, unlike in Japan or China, we already have 4 races within our own national population, and we respect that. Given that we have more than many other cities, we have a very large foreign population, which is also divided between the high income, middle income, and low income earners, and coming from different nationalities. What can we aspire to become? And my point here, I suppose, for the next 50 years, and what I have said in my lectures to younger people who are the ones who are going to inherit this country and build up the society, is that we can create a new paradigm for cohesive diversity in a global city. And the key factor for this to succeed is not just a tolerance of differences between people, it's actually a celebration of diversity. Now, there are several ways to inculcate a culture of diversity. Within the companies level, companies themselves, like in many countries in the Western world, they should create diversity and inclusion committees that really try to engender diversification. And somewhat of a play on words, because I think gender diversification and gender upliftment, we are one of the worst performing countries in Singapore. If you look at statistics for gender representation at the political level and at the corporate level, at the boardroom level, at the management level, Singapore actually has not done well compared to other countries, not to even talk about LGBT issues. Civil society should also welcome more diversity, and the government should also promote a sense of diversity beyond just the CMIO kind of silos. So essentially, my point is we can have a choice to create a shining, exemplary paradigm for Singapore as a society. If we are aware of all these things that we need to do, then essentially all of us with our own businesses and our own economies can aspire towards a common goal. But if we do not have a larger common goal, we're just running our own individual businesses. Now, that is sort of my kind of closing summary picture for everybody here. But, you know, as a wise man once said, why do we only talk about the long term? Because in the long term, we're all dead anyway. So, you know, we can talk about long term, but let's also focus a bit on the short term. So if you look at short term, let's say 5 years or so, what to me are some of the policy issues and some of the more business-related issues that I think concern all of us. I can think of three. The first is, I think all of us, government in particular, should focus not on aggregate productivity, but on sectoral productivity. All these things we read about Singapore's overall productivity, either having risen a little bit or is flat, it actually is quite meaningless to an economist because at an aggregate national level, it doesn't reflect very much. We all know that certain sectors are truly lagging behind in productivity. And that's essentially the domestic side of our economy. Our construction sector, our retail sector, hospitality, that truly has been lagging behind in productivity. And the government is catching up now, like in the mid-1980s when there was a wage revolution. We're seeing a second wage revolution now where there's a real tightening of screws on foreign workers, a big increase in labor costs in those sectors which have been exhibiting low productivity, and the government is now forcing these companies to pay higher wages, squeezing out foreign workers, and so on. I think the point to many companies here is that the focus has been far too broad. It's like taking a sledgehammer to solve a problem that could be solved through, I guess, more skillful use of a scalpel. And that is, there must be greater, and there is the beginning of this, but I would say probably greater focus on sectoral productivity improvement so that a lot of the companies that are already operating in relatively productive areas do not have to see the same squeeze on foreign workers. And that also leads to the second point, which is a need for a focus on more sectoral foreign labor reduction. Not one glove fits all. Not all companies in Singapore are able to hire only the Singapore core if you just refuse them work permits to hire foreigners. I myself have seen it with one of our companies. We're in the architectural design space. We've had to let a lot of workers, foreign talent, go. And we would be more than happy to hire Singaporean architects, but you just cannot find them. I'm sure you've read about the cases of Singapore Dance Theatre having to let some foreign ballerinas go because they were foreigners, as if you could really hire Singaporean ballerinas in lieu. This relatively broad brushstroke approach, I think, does not serve us well. And we need to have a much more careful examination of foreign labor reduction. At the same time, there needs to be incentives for those companies that are able to reduce the dependence on foreign workers. I've heard quite a number of companies telling me that they've reduced their dependence on foreign workers, but there's no rewards for that. So there must be some scheme whereby through being able to reduce your reduction on foreign workers, you are allowed perhaps some more foreign workers so that you are able to actually enjoy some of the gains from reducing your dependence on foreign workers. One final thing that has been brought up, I think, for some time is how if SMEs are going to be taken overseas so that they can have this so-called second wing, it is actually dependent on the larger Singapore companies, whether they are the TLCs, GLCs, or large MNCs, to be able to be incentivized through tax or other fiscal means, incentivized to be able to help bring Singapore companies overseas. There's a general talk about doing all this, but it's not enough so that multinationals and GLCs really do not enjoy anything specific if they help to bring Singapore companies overseas as suppliers or as partners or anything. So overall, and I don't want to take up your time because then I think everybody would rather be able to be finished with SG50 for the rest of today, and you have something else tomorrow. I guess my overall summary here is that we are always facing an uncertain future. And anytime we take stock, it just happens that this year is an arbitrary year, it's SG50, so we take stock of ourselves this particular year. But the future is always uncertain for us. But I do believe that despite the global tendency towards a downturn, despite the fact that in Singapore we're right in the midst of a relatively painful recession, I do believe that the future for Singapore really has never been brighter than it is today. If you look beyond the problems that we each have within our own companies, there are many reasons for us to feel optimistic about the future. But this requires a continual restructuring of the Singapore economy, of the Singapore workforce, through Skills Future and all these other things. But it does depend very much ultimately on all of us understanding what we want Singapore to be beyond just an economic entity. And I think we really do have the opportunity to be something unusual in this world, to create a new paradigm of a socially cohesive and vibrant society, which is economically sustainable and can be truly a shining example for other societies, as well as, for the first time for me, thinking as a grandfather for my grandchildren. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ho. So we've spent